want to know what it's fighting for. Podcast by George. 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 Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a great start, man. I out of all the intros, I got it. I've said that before, man. I love that. I can't hear that enough. That's from the kids of a podcast by podcast by George viewer, and I just love that beginning. Well, folks, we got a lot to talk about today. We've got our esteemed guest, Dr. Steffen W. Schmidt, coming on the podcast by George LiveLine. And by way of introduction, I love to read this bio. Dr. Steffen Schmidt earned a PhD in public law and government from Columbia University, New York. He's a founding and sustaining member of LULAC Council 307 in Iowa, one of the oldest Hispanic community and leadership organizations. He also served as the chair of the Iowa Governor's Spanish-Speaking Commission, later renamed Department of Latino Affairs. He was born and grew up in Colombia, folks. He's the author of, at least 10 books. And he's a co-author of American Government and Politics Today. I think it's in its 20th or 21st edition. That book is in more college classrooms, political science, than any other textbook. It was anyway. I think it still is. And he's the author of many articles and columns on Latin America, obviously, U.S. issues, cyber threats, the politics of disruption, and women in politics. He's a frequent political commentator of American and international media worldwide. Here in Hawkeye State, he's the recipient of the Iowa Governor's Volunteer Award for work with the Latino community and former chair of the Iowa Governor's Spanish-Speaking Commission. He's the Department of Latino Affairs, and you'll hear him break out that Spanish once in a while. That's pretty cool stuff. And of course, he's the Lugan Endowed Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Iowa State University. So let's bring him on in here and say hello, hi, how are you? Good morning to our good friend, our buddy, our pal, Doc Politics. Hi, Steffen.
Good morning. Good to see you again. And spring is coming, so we're all optimistic that things might get a little better.
Yeah, I hope they do get a little better. The news has been all bad recently. And matter of fact, I had one of my viewers comment recently that I was doing a lot of podcasts. And I said, well, my God, the world's at war virtually. I mean, we're in the midst of a pandemic. If you don't do podcasts now, when are you going to do them? You can easily get depressed. And, I kind of wanted to start on that angle. And based on your experience now, as I mentioned in the bio, man, you go way back. I go way back also. War is nothing new to you. You've seen a lot of this stuff, and you've been in this political realm the entire time. What happens to politics? How does it change? How does the discourse, change in times of war, which we're approaching now?
It's interesting because we tend to think, and I think the Biden administration thinks, when you're at war or at least, on the edge of it, and, there are adversaries and enemies, and you have to kind of try to deal with that the country comes and rallies around the government or rallies around patriotism and so on. And now that I think back on it, I'm not sure that's true. I think that is a myth that we would like to promulgate or continue. But I don't remember World War II. I was just a little kid, but reading about it, a lot of Americans were not very happy with FDR as president, who was going to get us in a war in Europe, that was way far away. It was none of our business. There was a lot of opposition. I clearly, as you do too, remember the Vietnam War, which turned out not to be a very popular war, and it didn't bring people together at all. In fact, it really divided the country. It took the anti-war protesters and those who were supporting our troops, who were not necessarily really enthusiastic about the Vietnam War, but they didn't want our troops coming home to be disrespected. And there was an enormous amount of division. And we see some of that still going on, I think, with the war unfolding in Ukraine. Some people are saying we should get in there and do more, and we shouldn't be afraid of Putin, and we should provide, jets and other airplanes to Ukraine to defend itself. And others are saying, no, we don't want to get involved in that because we're dealing with an adversary who is potentially very dangerous. So, sometimes things bring people together. The terrorist attacks of September 11 brought the country together for a very short period of time, but that all dissipated. So it is essentially an up and down process. It's a pendulum that swings back and forth between unity and saying we're all in this together and this is our president and we have to support him, and those who say this is all pretty bad and we need somebody new. And I think that's going to be the 2024 election discussion with Biden. Certainly his poll numbers are not holding up. The 2022 election for the House and Senate, you know, these elections between presidential elections, they don't look very good for the Democrats, and not a lot of unity going on there. And so I think division, conflict, disagreement is the, you know, meal of the day.
You know, there's a big push, as you mentioned, towards this arming up, maybe even having NATO go in, having the United States go in on the ground in Ukraine. And I'm not in that camp. I'm telling you, particularly at these early stages, I'm all about the ceasefire. I mean, see if we can get most, if not all of these folks to stand down, because that just reduces the body count while these things are negotiated. And I made up a little cheat sheet here, and I've had this on the show before, and I know you remember all of this because it's a big time history of some of the stuff that we were told prior to these conflicts of the past that turned out not to be true. And they came from intelligence sources and unnamed people behind the scenes. And I remind people that Hussein's army was supposedly throwing babies out of incubators in Kuwait. And that had a lot to do with people getting behind that first Gulf War. U.S. diplomat Susan Rice, she's still working around behind the curtain, folks. She's still active. She was on the record saying Gaddafi in Libya was providing his soldiers with Viagra to rape civilians. False reports of gas attacks in Douma, the civilians in Syria, which we used to bomb the shit out of and still occupy the wheat and oil fields there. Russia supposedly offering bounties to Afghan soldiers for killing Americans. And the list goes on and on. I mean, it's a long list, but they all have one thing in common. It's all not true. It's been debunked. It's been disproven. And I always recommend people exercise caution. Don't rush in, where angels fear to tread. Don't be a fool and go rushing in.
George, you know what it's called? It's called PSYOPs, which is psychological operations.
Yes.
And when you're dealing with an adversary, you want to basically demoralize them and you want to build up support for your side. And so that involves a lot of what is called, fabricated information. And, the same thing with Saddam Hussein, getting yellow cake uranium from Africa to supposedly build nuclear weapons or whatever. Those things are part of the game of war. So I do believe though that the people that we're finding in basements with their hands tied and their heads shot in Ukraine, I don't think, Putin wants us to believe that is all made up stuff. And I just cannot believe that that's true. I mean, we've got reporters from very reputable news sources going in and looking at it and being absolutely horrified. So I want to just say that information I don't think is true. Could I also just add a point that this morning came up in the discussion that I had with some very smart people? I wonder if Ukraine should have just said, we're not going to survive this. Putin has got 250,000 troops and all the tanks that he can assemble, airplanes, rockets, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons. Fighting this we may prevail for a few months or a month and a few places, but in the end, it's going to destroy our country, blow up all of our infrastructure, kill millions of people or hundreds of thousands, exile 4 million people. And maybe we just don't have much of a choice because the West is not going to come in here and fight Putin, and we don't have the ability to do it. So let's just say, okay, come on in and we'll work this out somehow and we'll get back at you in the future. But in the meantime, let's keep our country from being absolutely, basically devastated into nothing. I know that's kind of called surrender monkey, right? hands up, surrender.
It's not real popular. Yeah, right now there's
No,
not
it's
a
not
lot of
very
people.
popular. But what I'm
Yeah.
saying is some of these people that I've been consulting with said, what good is a Ukraine where there is no infrastructure left, where half the population is either displaced or a huge percentage of it is dead, and all the suffering. Maybe sometimes it's better to just face reality. And we thought that Putin was going to run over Ukraine and crush it very quickly. That turned out not to be true. But people are now looking at it and saying, Putin doesn't care about human rights and bodies in basements, and he says it's all a bunch of, propaganda. And so it's going to be very difficult when we finally sit down and do what is called a post-mortem, which is a terrible term when there's so many dead people. But after this is over, whenever that is, we're going to have a lot of discussion about what might have been a better way of dealing with all this, given the fact that the Western countries are basically pretty much chicken. The Europeans didn't want to get involved in anything. They haven't been spending a lot of money on their defense. They haven't been a believable force. They've become totally dependent on a country like Russia. And so what were we thinking was going to happen when this all unfolded? Yes, NATO is unified, but, Putin doesn't care about that, because a unified NATO, well, that's just, another thing for him to push against.
I agree with everything that you've said, but as I mentioned there, it's not real popular right now. There's a big push for people wanting to arm up and go in there and do something militarily. But my point is to agree with you is that right now, stand down, get a ceasefire, and I think Ukraine should offer to remain NATO neutral. Hell, tell Putin they'll be Switzerland if that's what he's wanting him to be. Those regions in the Donbass over there in the eastern part of Ukraine, tell him that those people will have self-determination. They'll be able to have democratically controlled elections to choose if they want to go to Russia, if they want to remain independent, as an example, or if they want to be a part of Ukraine, and tell Putin he's got to abide by that. And maybe the last point would be the shit that he's blown up, he's got to fix. Now, you can't bring those people back to life, and the atrocities can't be undone. And I want to make sure that I say also, even though I ran down that list earlier, Doc, some of these atrocities are real. There's no doubt about it. And I even pointed that out on an earlier episode of Podcast by George. Right. I'm going to play this clip, and people can see for themselves what I'm talking about. You're talking about what do you think was going to happen? What do you think is going to happen with war? I know one thing that's going to happen with war. This is out of the Associated Press. ICC prosecutor to open a probe into war crimes in the Ukraine. Yeah, man, you can't have war. There's never been a war that didn't have war crimes, folks. Let me tell you. This is Dateline, The Hague, Netherlands. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court said Monday that he plans to open an investigation as rapidly as possible into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Now, this gets interesting. Prosecutor Karim Khan said in a statement that the investigation will look at alleged crimes committed before the Russian invasion, but added that given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is my intention that this investigation will also encompass any alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of my office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. The court already had conducted a preliminary probe into crimes linked to the violent suppression of pro-European protests in Kiev in 2013-2014 by a pro-Russian Ukrainian administration, and allegations of crimes in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, in eastern Ukraine, where Russia has backed rebels since 2014. Okay, so that's what I was saying before we got to where we're at today, before Russia invaded, before this all began. That's a great Matthew Ho, by the way, that I was talking there to on an earlier podcast. Yeah, he's a big friend of Dog Politics and has said so on the air before. Yeah, he's very good. He's running for the U.S. Senate out in,
let me ask you a question, George. Okay, yeah. Let me ask you. You usually ask me questions. I get to ask you one.
Fire away,
Mr. Khan. How many divisions do you have? Mr. Khan has nothing. He is just a mouth talking.
Oh, that's
there
true.
isn't
Yeah.
any way he can enforce any human rights, that he can punish anyone for violations. He has nothing. He's a bureaucrat who says the right thing, and it's all written down and goes in the history books maybe. I sent you a list this morning of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. You can look at that list, and you tell me, do police departments also have all the criminals in the department on the department as part of their employees? No. But the Human Rights Commission has countries that are horrible in human rights. There isn't any way that they can enforce anything because everything is vetoed. So, if you're hoping for international bodies to come and enforce human rights in the world,
and get
you're
Putin,
very naive. You're a nice person. I have some friends like that, big supporters of the UN and stuff. You're really naive because there isn't any way that that's going to happen. So the only way to protect human rights is to punish those who are violating them. And that's a tricky thing, because it involves force and violence and
war. Like World War II.
And sometimes war.
Nuremberg and the Hague. Everybody's talking about taking, Putin, trying for war crimes. Well, how's that going to work? How do you get?
Because the Nuremberg war crimes against the Nazis for their atrocities, they were carried out after the German government was crushed and the Nazis were no longer in control, and you could go and arrest all these people and try them for war crimes. That's not the case. What are you going to do? Put a subpoena out for some of the Russian soldiers that committed these things to come to The Hague and sit in a trial? You think they're going to come to The Hague?
You're exactly,
so there are no consequences. Look at all the other countries in the world that have very poor human rights records. And sometimes people say we don't have a very good human rights record. We have more people in jail than any other country in the world. And our crime rate, when you look every morning at what's going on, it's atrocious. So we're living in a world that is very imperfect, George, and our friends.
You're singing my tune. Like I said, you don't need to look out around the world. You just need to look in the mirror. And to exactly that point, let me bring this up on screen. Well, this is Robert McNamara. I know that you've probably read this, Doc. I saw the documentary. It was outstanding. But Robert McNamara, the former, Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson during the Vietnam War, says, I don't fault Truman for dropping the nuclear bomb. The U.S.-Japanese war was one of the most brutal wars in all of human history. Kamikaze pilots, suicide, unbelievable. What one can criticize is that the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with what are, I'll call it, the rules of war. Was there a rule then that said you shouldn't bomb, shouldn't kill, shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in one night? And General Curtis LeMay said, and he's the guy that wanted to bomb Cuba, folks. He was a bomber from World War II. LeMay said if we had lost the war, he's referring to World War II, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. McNamara says, I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what made it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win? And so that's to the point that the Doc and I were talking about. These things are pretty much decided before they ever get to The Hague, and they're decided in war, and they're decided by who wins, who declares victory, who's a war criminal, and who's not. So you don't know where you're headed unless you know where you've been, and that's kind of what that's all about.
Absolutely right. And it's amazing, the two people that you just quoted, because they're basically hawks. They're basically people who, believed in force and strength. They would today be called conservatives, I guess, in that regard. And their criticism, is remarkable. Well, you've said it before, of course, that Eisenhower also said, that we are to some extent dependent on the military-industrial complex, and they have a lot of influence over what we do, and a lot of what we do is use force. But on the other hand, others are saying, Yes, but what are you going to do when you're attacked, when you've got countries that are mobilizing and becoming dangerous and will be a threat to you? You don't mobilize? I mean, that doesn't make any sense either. So we're sort of stuck where we are, frankly, George. You know, I remember the peace movement, and you know, in England they had this big movement to do away with nuclear weapons and stuff. And the only thing that kept, I think, the world at peace was nuclear weapons and the fact that nobody could use them because it was called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Yes. You bomb me, I have my bombs all on airplanes and in silos, and I'm going to bomb you, and there's not going to be anybody left. So deterrence sometimes is very useful, and we have to try to make sure we keep that balance, that we never go in that direction of trying to use those weapons.
Well, we like to have the doc on to talk politics, but politics is intrinsically linked to all of this. And I would say there are voices still adamantly calling for a ceasefire. Any level of ceasefire will reduce the amount of killing. So get what you can and see if some negotiations can get started. Before we leave this point, I want to bring this quote up, Doc, and this is another one that I know you're well familiar with. There are certain things that kind of burn or sear in my memory that I never forget. And this quote is one of them, and it has to do with this fools rushing in where angels fear to tread type of thing that I mentioned to start with. And that's kind of where we are now. Don't trust your leaders implicitly. And you talked about 9/11, the morning after 9/11. Let me bring this up on screen. I'll never forget this. Now, Richard Clark, he was Bill Clinton and Bush's, the administration's counterterrorism advisor. He was trusted by both those folks. He rushed to the Bush White House and found Rumsfeld, Cheney, and others talking about invading Iraq. Now, this is the day after September 11th, 2001. Clark told Colin Powell, having been attacked by Al-Qaeda, he knew who Al-Qaeda was, he said, for us now to go bombing Iraq in response would be like our invading Mexico after the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. What the hell for? Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq. A lot of people said Hussein was a mortal enemy of Al-Qaeda. One of the things he was most effective at was keeping him out of there. Now, that's out of Richard Clark's book. Again, the doc reads all this stuff. I just see the movies and the clips mostly. But the book is called Against All Enemies, Inside America's War on Terror. So like the great Bob Dylan said, don't trust your leaders, particularly immediately and implicitly when situations like this break out. See if you can get folks to stand down and figure this out, because sometimes they can be wrong, seriously wrong.
But the other thing is we got to remember that one reason that we went into to overthrow Saddam Hussein is because after the first Gulf War, there was some evidence, maybe not, that Saddam Hussein had ordered George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior Bush who was president, to be assassinated. And George W. Bush wanted revenge for Saddam Hussein ordering that. And that was one reason for the staff in the White House and for, George W. Bush to go along with the idea of that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. And Saddam Hussein was not a nice guy. I mean, you talk about torture chambers and his repression of any opposition. He was brutal. But on the other hand, there wasn't much choice, and the idea that the United States can bring democracy to the Middle East or a country like Iraq was sort of a silly idea. That if I'd been advising the White House, I would have said, it's never really worked. You can't really build nations. If you have a country that is doing it on its own, you can help them. But you can't go in there and take a government like Saddam Hussein's and overthrow it and set up a democracy. I mean, that was just a stupid idea, frankly. And even worse was the idea that Iraq would become an example to all of the Middle East, and all the countries in the Middle East would now be contaminated by Iraqi democracy and would become democracies. Who the hell thought that up? I mean, give me a break. We need some people going into the White House as advisors who have half of a common sense and go to a grocery store every once in a while and go down to the dog park and talk to people like I do. The people in the dog park are a lot smarter than the people in the White House for the most part. in terms of common sense.
I got to agree with you, particularly the White House that we're talking about with George W. Bush. Now, I'm not a major conspiracy type guy, but even a minor conspiracy theorist would think if you were someone that will have Iraq, you believed in this domino theory of overthrowing these countries in the Middle East. You wanted the oil that was there and that type of thing. You wanted the United States to invade. Let's say you were one of those folks, and there are folks like that active in politics in Washington, D.C. today, folks. But let's say you were of that mind back then. Now, George W. was not the brightest. Matter of fact, he might have been the dimmest bulb in the box. I don't know that he understood what Al-Qaeda was or Iraq or any of those circumstances, but he did love his dad. So if I was somebody and I wanted to take action against Iraq and start those dominoes to tumble, I'd go whisper in George W. Bush's that somebody there was threatening to kill his daddy. And maybe that had a lot to do with getting that ball rolling. I think you're exactly right. Well, my God, we're almost halfway through the show, Doc. We got to turn our attention to some of the reason that I was here and actually what I promoted on the show. And it has to do with something again, and you're extremely knowledgeable. My God, we could talk about what you know for on this topic for hours. But the Iowa caucuses. Now, let me bring this up on screen here. Now, this is out of Axios, the newsletter. Members of the Democratic National Committee voiced support Monday. Now, this is this might be a week or two old, but for the 2024 presidential nominating procedures under review that could dislodge Iowa from its 5-decade status as the caucus starting point. You want to talk to somebody that knows about the 5-decade status as the caucus starting point? You got to talk to Doc Politics, folks. I mean, this is why we've got him on the show here. State of play. Under the proposal, the party would set the 2024 presidential nominating calendar based on factors such as diversity, competitiveness in the general election, and the ability to administer a fair process. The outcome is months away, but members made clear Monday that changes are in sight to better represent voters and improve the party's chances of winning. And don't underestimate the significance of that. They want to win, and they think getting rid of the Iowa caucuses may help them do that. Now, what they're saying, RBC member Leah Daugherty, the former CEO of the Democratic National Convention Committee, said the changing electorate necessitates a review because Democrats cannot be stuck in a 50-year-old calendar when trying to win modern elections. Yes, but the goal must be to produce the strongest presidential nominee. Scott Brennan, a former Iowa Democratic Party chairperson and RBC member, said in Monday's meeting, the proposal could front-load the process with larger states and create a gate that only well-established candidates could pass, warned RBC member David McDonald of Washington State. Now we're getting through this. The other side, Iowa Republicans are backing state Democrats in their caucus retention efforts. So this is interesting. This is strange bedfellows type stuff here. Iowa GOP chairperson Jeff Kaufman told Fox News, Jeff Kaufman said last week that if the DNC gives up on Iowa, this is literally the middle finger at rural America. What's next? The RBC is expected to vote on the proposal at its next meeting in mid-April. That's coming up, folks. If approved, states that wish to go first in the presidential nominating process will present to the committee. The full DNC would likely make a calendar determination in August or September. And Doc, you and I have talked about this. Former Iowa Democratic Party Chair Troy Price told Axios last year that Iowa's first caucus status was a target for those who have wanted to butt ahead in the process long before the state's botched 2020 event, which he was mightily involved in. I mean, I got to tell you something. That's the pot calling the kettle black there. That's very interesting. Okay, so that's the background. People heard about the Iowa caucuses maybe going away, but I was very interested to read something that you had written recently. You've got a solution to this problem, which may be doable.
Well, first of all, it's a bunch of baloney that the Iowa caucuses didn't pick or at least identify potentially electable presidential candidates. I met George McGovern. I've talked to George McGovern at the very beginning before, the first Iowa caucuses. Jimmy Carter won the Iowa caucuses, sort of, and got elected president. You got Bill Clinton and you got, others who have won with the Iowa caucuses just sort of identifying people who might be good candidates. Iowa never picked the candidate for president. That's a bunch of crap. My solution is to say, look, there are going to be Iowa caucuses first in the nation. They're going to be the Republican caucuses. And so the news media from all over the world is coming to Iowa, and the Democrats aren't going to have their caucuses, but the Republicans are. So why don't the Democrats run a really great straw poll that is open to any registered Democrat, only Iowa registered Democrats, not from Nebraska or Minnesota or Illinois, only Iowa Democrats, and let them vote in that straw poll. They can vote online, or they can even go down to the fairgrounds and vote there, whatever, so that on caucus night, the Democrats also have a list of people that Iowa active Democrats who voted in the straw poll think they might want to see running for president. Now, Biden probably is going to be running, right? I mean, that may be. But the 2024 Iowa caucuses, the Republican caucuses, in my opinion, are going to be huge. Why? Because who are the Republicans going to pick for president? Is it going to be, in fact, given to Donald Trump as, just he's the senior guy and he's going to get it? Is it going to be DeSantis? I happen to be in Florida right now, and Governor DeSantis of Florida is very actively doing things that to me suggest he's going to run for president. And he's going to be in Iowa pretty soon, I think, talking about don't say gay and other things that he's using as campaign slogans. He's going to try to shut down Disney World's special status because they are still continuing to, be, let's call it, kind and friendly and open to gay folks. And so the Republican first in the nation caucuses in Iowa, I think, are going to be enormous. The world media is going to come. Donald Trump is going to be there yelling and shouting, and DeSantis is, and several of the others. There are about 5 Republicans who I think are going to try to run. Why don't the Democrats take advantage? If the National Party prohibits it, and the National Party screwed up the last caucuses because they forced the Iowa caucuses to use an app that was created by Hillary Clinton's
a shadow app.
Shadow app. What a name,
Yeah.
And so the Democratic National Committee is controlled by a bunch of people who are not necessarily right. They're not necessarily right. The Iowa caucuses and everything leading up to the caucuses gave Democratic contenders for president a huge amount of free publicity all over the country. They could talk about what they would like to do, their programs, their philosophy. That was what the Iowa caucuses did. They were really just a kind of straw poll anyway, because not very many delegates to the national convention came out of the Iowa caucuses. Big states, California and Texas and, New York and others, they were the ones that dominated the national convention. So the Iowa caucuses were just a way for Democrats to be in the news all the time with their candidates coming and eating all kinds of strange food on a stick at the state fair and, kissing little hogs. I remember Jesse Jackson, they handed him a little pig. He was wearing a 4-piece suit. Jesse Jackson always dressed just incredibly formally, and he was out on some farm, and they give him a little pig, and he grabs it and looks at it and gives it back. That made the national news. Was that bad? No, it was fun. It was fun. Now we're going to get woke, and we're going to get all serious and awful. And I think the Democrats are going to lose a huge amount of free publicity, billions of dollars, frankly, billions of dollars of free publicity that they got out of the Iowa caucuses. So have a nice straw poll, and let Iowa Democrats, sort of say who they like. Don't give it to the huge states where it's all going to be done on television, and there isn't going to be any of the nice face-to-face where people can go into little communities and talk to in a fire station or a school or a church or, a 7-Eleven if there are any, and talk to ordinary people, which is what the Iowa caucuses did. Primaries are awful. They're very difficult for people as well. You have to stand in line sometimes for an hour or two Nobody's allowed now to give you a bottle of water anymore in those primaries and things. It's just sort of I think a mistake, and politicians make a lot of mistakes. The Democratic National Committee ought to look in the mirror and ask themselves, how well did we do in the last election in getting Democrats elected to the House and the Senate? The answer is you didn't do a very good job at all.
And wait until 2022. Yeah.
We don't see in the House and Senate a real majority. The House, yes, more, but in the Senate, there isn't any Democratic majority. So how well did you do in helping to find and support and promote candidates for the Democrats? And the answer is you did a lousy job.
Well, I put some of your paper up on screen there that folks can read along with that. I'll link to it in the description for the video as well. I like a lot of what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense. For one thing, here you get too close to an issue. You think caucuses. Oh my God, we can't lose the Iowa caucuses. Well, for the rest of the world, they don't know what a caucus is. They don't care. You can call it a straw poll. You can call it anything you want to. As long as it's first, it still has that effect, that positive effect for the state of Iowa. But my question is, Doc, on a couple of fronts now, would the Democratic Party squash that idea because they're going to want that sanctity reserved for another larger state? And if people think the Democratic Party wouldn't do that to Iowa and wouldn't do that to its own constituency, I encourage them to look at the last Iowa caucus and that shadow app that the doc was talking about, because they're still trying to figure out what the hell that was all about. And then the other question is, it requires bedfellows. The Republicans, will they want to preserve the Iowa caucuses or for the Republican Party? And the reason I ask that is I'm thinking back to 2016, and, Trump didn't win the Iowa caucus for the Republicans in 2016. Ted Cruz did. And as you know, the folks that run the Republican Party, now I'm not as certain about this. You got to deal with Republicans all the time. They hated that Ted Cruz dude. They still hate Ted Cruz. So that was their most recent experience in 2016. Of course, in 2020, Trump was the de facto candidate, so it didn't come into play there. But are the Republicans willing to, go to the wall to preserve the Iowa caucuses?
Maybe. I mean, remember, you don't really have to win first place in the Iowa caucuses to be a credible and potentially successful contender in the nomination and then in winning an election. I've written about this and talked about it all over the world, actually, and the international news media doesn't understand the caucuses, so they often come to me and they actually, invite me down to their headquarters, and I have to give briefings to their reporters and their anchors to explain to them how this works. In Iowa, you could come in first, second, or third, and sometimes the third was a pretty good place because the third went on to win in New Hampshire and other primaries and got the nomination and maybe became president. So Ted Cruz didn't really win the Iowa caucuses. There's no such thing. Donald Trump and Ted Cruz did pretty well. And then they went on and forged their own victories in New Hampshire and other places. And so that's what the Iowa caucuses for both the Democrats and Republicans did. And let me say to the Republicans in Iowa, you may not have liked at the beginning Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, but Donald Trump proved to some extent to be a very, very successful contender and won election to the White House. And so the Iowa Republicans who went and supported him in the caucuses, they seem to know something about where conservatives and evangelicals and others in all of the United States were headed and what they were concerned about, right? I mean, you may not like Donald Trump, but he got elected president, and people, a very large number of people, still, for whatever their reasons are, I don't question those, support Donald Trump. And if you're in some places in the country, you will see pickup trucks. I've seen them just this morning. I saw one with 2 American flags, with a big, huge flag for Trump, huge flag saying F-U-C-K Biden, there's still a lot of passion. And Iowa Republicans who went to the caucuses and said, Donald Trump, might be pretty good. He's a businessman and all that. They were onto something. And don't ever let any national Republican or Democratic bureaucrats in Washington sitting around in some moldy office where their headquarters is tell me that they know more about where voters in this country are than Iowa Democrats or Republicans, because they're out there. They're, at Fairway and Hy-Vee and other little grocery stores and at Casey's and other places talking to each other. And when they go and vote in a caucus, they're voting because they know what their neighbors are talking about. That's not true in huge states where everything is completely impersonal and all media driven and money driven. And that was the thing about Iowa that, was to some extent a good idea. You didn't need a lot of money. Jimmy Carter was unknown and had no money. And I remember sitting in the middle of July, it was 110 degrees under some huge trees at a friend's farm in Collins or somewhere. And all of a sudden bicycles appeared and they came down the long path, the farm lane to us. And this guy gets off and walks up to us and says, "Hi, my name's Jimmy Carter." And we're like, yeah, I think I read about you. And he shook my hand and his wife shook our hand and there were a bunch of staff people. And he said, "I'm running for president," and got back on his bicycles and they left and went on. And guess what? Jimmy Carter was able to become the candidate of the Democrats by doing retail politics in Iowa and meeting a lot of people. I mean, there were only about 8 or 9 of us at the barbecue at my friend's place, but he came to us and introduced himself. That will never happen in California or in Pennsylvania or New York or Texas.
Well, we got to move on. That's a great history. And I love to tell the story too. And I was at Drake campus in college when the slate of presidential Democratic candidates came and they all presented and talked. I was in the journalism department. I could have covered any candidate that I wanted to. So I picked the one that I liked the best, that I thought was most likely to win. And it was a guy named Mo Udall. But the rest of he's gone into the dustbin of antiquity. Nobody remembers that at all. Well, that's great stuff, Doc. All right, I'm going to move here. I'm going to get on to this next thing because I'm very interested in this. Now, folks that watch my podcast, they know the Dr. Politics is on here all the time. But my God, if you've been looking at local, state, national, or international media over the last 30 or 40 years, you've seen him there as well. And he was seen recently here. This is Newsy. It's a kind of a new format, a new style, not website, but a digital streaming service that can be picked up by televisions that have digital antennas. Now, I'm just starting to hear about this, and I'm just starting to read into it a little bit. And I like what I read because, as it says here, by Newsy advances your understanding of a news story by highlighting unique perspectives from across the media spectrum. Newsy provides what you need to know about the day's events. Okay, so that sounds good. Who we are. Newsy is your source for concise, unbiased video news and analysis covering the top stories from around the world with persistent curiosity and no agenda. We strive to fuel meaningful conversations by highlighting multiple sides of every story. Newsy delivers the news and perspective you need without the hype and bias common to many news sources. Okay, that's the good news. Well, here's the bad news, maybe. I don't know. This is from their site also. Advertising and syndication. Newsy helps connect brands and consumers in an engaging and authentic environment. We're also a preferred content partner for premium publishers who want to connect with a millennial audience. Okay, that basically says that they're out soliciting advertising. And, if you don't have a subscription format, and a subscription format means you'll have loyal followers, but you'll have very few of them because they're having to pay a subscription to subscribe to it. So they're doing it through advertising. But, Doc, this reminds me of, and this is another book. I don't know if folks can see it here that I have behind me here, Hate Incorporated, written by the great Matt Taibbi. And he was talking about the broadcast channels in particular, MSNBC versus Fox with CNN somewhere in the middle, and how we're stuck with that here in the country. And what he had proposed, I remember him talking about, he wanted to start a network, obviously, called Neither Side News. And I thought that was a cool idea, and that sounds a little bit like what Newsy is talking about. And I'm going to play a clip here where you were on Newsy, but what was your kind of first take on Newsy?
Well, I think you're right. They want to go a little bit more in depth than the normal coverage. And so my particular little contribution was they were doing something on American political parties, and there are only two political parties. And why is that? And should there be more than two? And can there in the future be more than two? And they did, they would seem to ask some very neutral and intelligent questions. And they interviewed a bunch of other people from the Green Party and others. And I've talked to a lot of people who are experts on the new media platforms, and they said, yeah, they like Newsy. They think that it's, for, let's call it, intelligent and curious viewers like yours. I mean, yours are all very liberal, or many of them are, but this is more neutral. And I thought they did a fair job with me. And I told them, if you want me to do more in the future, I'm happy to do it. So, and because it's the way the platform is, it can be viewed anywhere in the world, and just like your podcast.
I like it. I'm starting to look into it, and what I'm seeing, I like so far, and it's extremely well done. It's funded by the Scripps folks. They got a huge background in educational materials, I think, and it really is informative. Yeah, that's exactly right.
I mean, they need the advertising, but they also, funded it so that they can start out with fairly decent production quality.
Yeah, and the fact that they're not dependent on the advertising because they've got those big bucks behind it means that's probably a good thing. But then you got to look very closely at Scripps. Okay, now I'm play this clip. I want people to take a look at this because this is I was intrigued by this, and I'm looking at things like maybe some other people might not be. I'm looking at their set. I'm looking at their host here that poses the question. It's all very good. So here's the doc on Newsy.
My bottom line question for you then, could you envision a way in which third parties would be successful in our government?
If the two parties completely fail to live up to the expectations of the American people, completely fail to solve problems and create policies that are acceptable, accepted, and respected, people may flee away from them and somebody else may come along. But, we have a country of 50 states, of territories, of Puerto Rico, and all of those are part of the game. And you can't just nationalize a new third party. A third party has to have the roots in the 50 states, territories, and in Puerto Rico. And that's a massive job, very expensive, and logistically almost impossible to do for someone to come along and say, hey, I'm going to create a new party in all 50 states. And so, yes, it could happen. I think it probably won't in the near future anyway.
Okay. Well, Dr. Steffen Schmidt, thank you for your insight and for really walking us through this. Thank you for joining us on Newsy.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so like I said, I was looking at that with kind of a critical eye, and I like everything that I'm seeing there. I was particularly impressed with the young host there. It's a lot easier on the eyes than old Podcast by George, obviously, but that's kind of the nature of network television. But she was well informed, Doc. Her questions were very good. This was not Bush League stuff that I was looking at. I was impressed.
Yeah, no, and I don't know how much of the half hour that they interviewed me actually made it on air, but I mean, one point that I made, I think that's important, is that political parties are essentially a kind of a tradition. And, people are comfortable with saying that they're a Democrat or a Republican, regardless of who is in charge of the party. And it's hard to develop that kind of generational loyalty with a third party like the Green Party or the Democratic Socialists or whatever. And then also that the rules of how you can get on a ballot in the United States are written by the two parties, and they don't want any competition. I said this because many people have contacted me from this, and I said, just think if you went into a grocery store and wanted to buy cereal, and the choice was 2 cereals, and that's it, right? I mean, we want a little more choice than 2, and we don't really have it. I mean, yes, I had some of my students voted for third-party candidates and asked me what I thought, and I said, you vote however you feel comfortable, but understand your candidate is not going to win, because the chances are that they will get very much fewer percentage of the vote than either a Democrat or Republican. So you're kind of expressing yourself, but it's a symbolic gesture. It's not pragmatic. You're not going to have any people from that particular party in the Iowa legislature or in the Congress. And that's sort of the way the reality is. So,
well, and here in our political system, a lot of people are voting for the lesser of two evils. They're not actually voting for someone; they're voting against someone else, and that's got a lot to do with nobody wanting to venture forth and vote for or support a third party. I'm going to play another clip here real quick because we're running out of time, Doc. I don't know if you've seen this one before. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but this is Lawrence O'Donnell driving home a very important part here. This is I love to play this, so watch this.
If you want to pull the party, the major party that is closest to the way you're thinking, to what you're thinking, you must show them that you're capable of not voting for them. If you don't show them you're capable of not voting for them, they don't have to listen to you. I promise you that. I worked within the Democratic Party. I didn't listen or have to listen to anything on the left while I was working in the Democratic Party, because the left had nowhere to go.
So that's Lawrence O'Donnell talking about that. And so it's risky business, this third party thing. I mean, if you go out there and vote for that, you might end up getting the evil that you're so terrified about getting. But this is a very interesting point that I've heard, Doc, and I wanted to get your opinion on what Lawrence O'Donnell is saying. But also this, in 2016, we had that choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And anybody but blue, or that saying. I mean, they'll just vote Democratic no matter who, blue no matter who. That's the phrase that I'm trying to come up with. Well, of course, even the Bernie supporters that had been so disenfranchised and screwed, basically, in Iowa and other places in 2016, actually came out and voted for Hillary Clinton. And the point that some of these 30-party people are saying is, if they had not done that, but they had instead voted for a third party, it would have perhaps forever changed the Democratic Party in 2016. It would have moved them towards those, from my perspective, left-wing issues that we desire so mightily that we're not getting. And the point of the matter is, you would have gotten that. And you got to remember now, Donald Trump won anyway in 2016, and because of the Electoral College in that situation. But they lined up behind Hillary. They supported her. The Democratic Party did not change. If anything, it moved further right after Trump won. And so that was an opportunity lost again, because everyone's so afraid of, losing to the greater of two evils.
Well, that's an interesting theory. And I don't encourage people to do anything in particular, but, if you vote for a party that is a minor party that you really love and agree with, you're probably helping the other party win. So, I view it as a zero-sum game, frankly. I don't think the Democrats would have done anything differently in the next election, in the next selection of a candidate. Hillary Clinton lost, and I thought they might have learned a lesson there. But they chose Biden, who is the most sort of, in the middle of the road kind of conservative Democrat in some respects. People say he's left wing. He's not left wing. The Republicans are all crazy about this radical communist. He's very conservative in many ways, and they voted for him anyway. They didn't learn anything, or perhaps what they learned was that Hillary Clinton had some, personal issues. She made a few flubs, a few mistakes, talking about the unspeakables, I call them. That's not what she called them, but
deplorables. Yeah.
The deplorables was something that drove away quite a few people. And, she was a woman, and I still think, and I tell my friends who, think more women should run for office, yes, they should, but probably a lot of people just weren't comfortable with a woman president. I remember people saying that, really. And she was connected to a lot of, the Clinton machine, which some people just really didn't like. They wanted Bernie Sanders. The left wanted Bernie Sanders, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll have to see what happens in 2024. I don't know if Biden is going to be running again. I don't know if Kamala Harris, has enough momentum and roots to really run. But we'll see what happens.
I look at it, I think, if not Biden, who? Kamala Harris has an approval rating that's right up there with a convicted used car salesperson or something. I mean, it's in the basement. And I don't know who else is out there. I mean, if they can prop Biden up, I think they're going to run him. I mean, unless he
maybe, but he's not. He is. I'm old, and I want to say he's too old, and probably just should say, look, I'm going to support, Amy Klobuchar or somebody like that. Those are the names that are starting to pop up for 2024, frankly. And we'll see, we'll see what happens. It's going to be one of the most exciting years for elections in the history of this country. There have been other very exciting years, but 2024 is going to be unbelievable. It's going to be fun, dangerous, incredibly, off to the cliff. And are we going to fall off the cliff or not? Very divisive. And, it's like a great sporting event where you don't know the outcome. And we're all going to watch it and be involved and hopefully get people to participate.
And we'll be watching you. I know you'll be a part of it, just like that Newsy clip. And you've been involved for so long. Doc, you're extremely generous with your time. As you mentioned, you and I have been around for a while. We're supposed to be retired, pal. So I appreciate you coming on this podcast.
Don't retire. You're going to work harder if you retire than when you were working.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Now, anything in closing here that I didn't ask that you want to make sure that you emphasize or say again?
No, I'm very depressed about what's happening in Ukraine. I think that we're now going to rely on the United Nations and other bodies that have, Stalin asked the Pope when the Pope criticized him, how many divisions do you have? And none of these agencies, they're all bureaucrats. They have no divisions and they have no way of enforcing human rights. And that is a lesson that we're learning that I wish we weren't learning. It's horrible. I sent you the list of all the countries that were on the human rights or are on the Human Rights Commission of the UN, and it makes you sick.
Yeah. And particularly when you look at their history, and there are critics of this country that would tell you to scrutinize and look at us a little more closely, going back to that Vietnam War. Yeah.
We need to do better.
All right, Doc, we're going to let you go for now, pal. Appreciate it. Thanks again for coming on this Podcast by George LiveLine.
Thank you.
Yeah, and folks, if you like Podcast by George, if you appreciate seeing and hearing the great Dr. Politics, Steffen W. Schmidt on the PBG LiveLine, please follow us on Facebook. You can like us there, and then on YouTube, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and maybe leave a comment or two. That helps us defeat the algorithm there on YouTube to try to get more views. And of course, we're available in audio on all of the major audio platforms where podcasts are heard, including Stitcher and Amazon and like the iHeartRadio app and iTunes, places like that. But that's going to do it for today. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.